What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name is Phillip Russell, and I am with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And Ben, this week we have Gareth Damien Martin. They are an award-winning writer, designer, and artist, and their first game, In Other Waters, won the Jury Prix at IndieCade in Europe, and most recently, they are known for this new cyberpunk game called Citizen Sleeper, which places players in the role of an escaped worker on a lawless space station on the edge of the interstellar society, and it's kind of exploring ideas around capitalism, precarity, and gig work. This was a really interesting conversation about a game that, at least for me, was kind of like a surprise hit and really affected me. So it was really cool talking with them.
Yeah, Phil, we have a friend, Joe, who has created the Joeys, which are, his version of the Oscars. Like, here are the movies that he thinks are the best ones of the year. This, for me, is going to get a Benny, like solid Benny candidate. Easily, I think, like probably the best story game I feel like that I've had a chance to play this year. You're kind of put on this spaceship and right away you are forced to make these really hard choices about, are you going to eat? Are you going to find enough of this kind of tech juice that you need because you're kind of a robot that is in the process of basically breaking down because you're meant to be a worker for this huge corporation, and because you've escaped, your body is like slowly falling apart. And so you're forced into this situation where often I think you're making these really hard choices between trying to help other people, trying to kind of move the story forward, and just like basically trying to survive. Like, stasis costs a lot for you in this game, and it's done through these dice. You kind of get dice at the start of every turn, and the lower dice you can't do a ton with, and then the higher dice will give you like these rolls that can move things forward. And so it, I think, really captures this feeling of just precarity and nothing ever quite working out and trying to survive with the scraps that you're given, that I think like at baseline was just like such a powerful game, and I know like really resonated with both of us.
Yeah, and I think for me it was really interesting because Gareth is somebody that I had been following on Twitter for like a couple of years, I think, and it was just one of those scenarios where I must have seen something that they had tweeted and I had started following them, but I wasn't like really keeping up. But ironically enough, it was like I was seeing all these screenshots for Citizen Sleeper over the years, and like personally, when I was like looking at the screenshots, I was like, oh, that's probably not a game that I'd be interested in. So like it really wasn't on my radar. And then to finally like pick it up after there was kind of this huge blow up of like positive critical response right when it released, it really just kind of blew me away in terms of what it was doing on a narrative level, and how, like you were saying with the dice mechanics, how it was blending its gameplay mechanics into really resonant narrative moments. And, in this conversation, we get so much into, how Gareth approached, conceptualizing those mechanics, how they kind of came to the idea of Citizen Sleeper through their own work in graduate school and working on novels. And I think just really get into like precarity and kind of what Gareth is trying to explore in Citizen Sleeper, and like the various ways that capitalist society pushes marginalized people to the margins, right?
Yeah, and I think like just so beautifully written. Like I think that's one thing that is like maybe worth mentioning at the top is one of the things that this game I think really stands out for is its writing. You get to these kind of long paragraphs of each story beat, and I don't know about you, but like I would kind of come back to those. There's this really beautiful kind of haunting music that'll be in the background, and there is something about playing this game, especially kind of late at night, which is often when I would have a chance to kind of sit down and play it, that I don't know, there was something about these like well rendered and well written paragraphs and this kind of contemplative but like sad music in the background that I just found like very affecting.
Yeah, 100%. I think like that would be just a perfect jumping off point to getting into the conversation with Gareth. Again, it was really, really interesting and I think kind of eye-opening to talk with Gareth about the game and about visual novels and as a medium. And yeah, as always, if you enjoyed the conversation, feel free to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And especially, we'd really love to hear from y'all over email. If you have any kind of thoughts on the episode, ideas for what a future episode could be, or you just want to tell us something, feel free to hit us up at our email, theoriginstorypod@gmail.com.
Should I tweet at Gareth and let them know that they're getting a Benny? Like, do you think that's? Do you think they'd care?
I think you need to at least like design what the Benny's going to look like.
Oh, okay. All right, that's fair.
Like, is it a trophy? Is it a badge?
I'm thinking like definitely a trophy. Yeah.
Well, more on that at the tail end of the show. Let's get right into it. Gareth Damien Martin is an award-winning writer, designer, and artist. Their first game, In Other Waters, won the Jury Prix at IndieCade Europe. Most recently, they released the critically acclaimed role-playing game Citizen Sleeper, which places players in the role of an escaped worker on a lawless space station on the edge of interstellar society, and explores themes from capitalism, gig work, living with disability, precarity, and more. Gareth, we're so excited to talk with you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, as always, we like to start with just like, how are you doing? You know, you've released this game. It's gotten so much press coverage, I feel like. I'm just curious, like, what's that feeling like? And, you know, how have you been since it's kind of out there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's really great. It's been fantastic. It's been kind of, I think because the game is on Game Pass, it's been really cool to see the kind of long tail of people still talking about the game and still discovering the game. I'd usually be maybe a little bit scared to kind of name search my own game on social media, but actually I've found that like it's just kind of wall to wall good vibes. So I'm enjoying that part of it. It's really nice, and it's kind of like Citizen Sleep is kind of designed to be a bit of a living project and a bit of a living world. And so it's really fun to get into that part of it, as opposed to the part of it where I was kind of keeping it a bit secret and wasn't sure if it would work out, and, you know, had a lot of experiments and questions that I didn't have answers to, but now I have a lot more answers to them, and I can kind of build on it and think about it, and it's out there, which is really great.
Yeah, we've talked to some folks in the past who I think are on different ends of the spectrum in terms of engaging with, you know, what people are saying or what people are writing about, or, you know, people's reactions to the game. To, you know, on the other hand, we had some folks on who were talking about like watching all of the different Twitch streams and seeing how people were playing through things. And what is your maybe relationship to people's, you know, reactions to or playing through of the game?
Yeah, I mean, I did watch some stuff. I watched one by Jack DeKeat, who is a composer. He's a games writer as well, and he works on the show, the actual play podcast, Friends at the Table. And that was really fun because I love Friends at the Table, and it was really fun to hear Jack reading out all of the words I'd written and things like this when it launched. And they have a wonderful voice, and I think that it's also, I think that there's definitely something funny that happens. It even happened when I streamed the game after launch. Is I was reading out the text in the game in the intro, and even hearing myself say it out loud, I was like, wow, this game is written in a really weird way. Like I've got so used to the style that I've used for this game, but hearing it out loud, I'm like, this is quite unusual for video game writing. I'd kind of forgotten that it was as unusual as it is in a way as I developed it, because I've read that intro like, I don't know, countless thousands and thousands of times. It's one of the first things I wrote. So yeah, when you hear it out loud on launch, you're like, oh, okay.
That's interesting. I mean, I think, Ben and I both come from an English academic background. And, it's funny, when I started Citizen Sleeper, that was kind of one of the first things I clocked, was that the writing felt really familiar for me, coming from like graduate studies and like just reading so much literature. And I'm curious, maybe if you could take us back to the genesis of the project, because I know that you also have a PhD in experimental literature. Like, did this start maybe as just like a prose work and then evolved, or did it always was a game or a tabletop game always maybe the goal?
It's a weird one, because the more I've been asked this question and had to think about it, the more that I keep remembering other bits of Citizen Sleeper that come from different places in my life. So I think it's kind of a hybrid of a lot of things. And the obvious, like always the most obvious influences and the most obvious origin is kind of like the most recent origin, right? So the kind of origin which is straight after In Other Waters, kind of having discovered tabletop role-playing games and contemporary ones during the development of In Other Waters, and learnt to run them and kind of really enjoying running them, and seeing all of these systems that exist in them, especially in Blades in the Dark, which is where I kind of take the idea of clocks from, and some of the dice rules, although it's actually in the end it's not that similar. But that I kind of like I saw that all this stuff was here, and I was like, oh, nobody's actually putting this in games, so this is a huge untapped resource. And if I could figure out like how to bring some of these qualities across the games, I feel like I could do something very interesting. And so that's one origin, right? That's one point at which you can kind of say, okay, it was about that. But also I've been wanting to make a story about being a gig worker in a chaotic city for a long time. And my PhD in experimental literature, my journey in experimental literature started with a novel that I wrote. I think it was in my early 20s, about a person who lives in London, and in London is a weird city where everything is built on top of each other, has this crazy history. And if you go into a cafe in London, you'll go to find the toilet, and you'll go down a set of stairs, and then you'll go into like this kind of non-space. I guess like now it's like the liminal space meme, right? You enter into this corridor where like there's 20 doors for some reason, but only one of them is to a toilet, and all of the others just say like private, no access on them. And so this character basically goes into one of these spaces, and then they like go through one of these doors, and then they meet a person there, who then kind of disappears, and they start becoming obsessed with finding this person, and they kind of slowly uncover this whole like sub-society that basically exists in like bathroom corridors and interconnected things. And it was a really weird novel that was kind of about my experiences being unemployed and doing crap jobs in London. But I wrote that novel, and then I left it alone. And then one day I found it on my computer, and I fed it into like a speech scrambler, like a text scrambler. And what I found was like the output from that text scrambler, usually you just put like a popular song in there, right? And it just kind of messes it up, and it's like, oh, it's funny. That was like, it's done a funny and silly thing. But when you put like 60, 70,000 words in it, you produce like this mad combinatorial like construction. And I was like, oh, this stuff's incredible. So I was feeding it in and getting this stuff out, and feeding in and getting out. And I started a whole practice basically of like working with procedural machines and trying to kind of like feed text in, then take it and feed it back in, rewrite it, adjust it. And so this was what my PhD was all about. And while Citizen Sleeper was not written like that, I think like the idea of kind of being an individual who's like finding all of the connections in a kind of urban space and is digging into kind of the weirdness. And then also the idea of stories that are all kind of like placed next to each other and can overlap and can talk to each other was also something I was really interested in. So that's like a whole other literary origin for Citizen Sleeper as well. And yeah, and then it's just my kind of also my own experience. And I think like, you know, the Citizen Sleep is also obsessed with bodies, and it's obsessed with kind of depersonalization. It's obsessed with all those things, because those are things that I've experienced and kind of tried to put in my art and tried to find ways to talk about them, and not to kind of like make conclusions, but just to kind of explore like those atmospheres and qualities and try to kind of put them in. So yeah, the more I dig into it, the more I'm like, oh, there are too many origins for me to really like make a nice, easy answer. So some days I say one and some days I say the other. And yeah, today I'm saying those three for now, at least.
So, I mean, I think bouncing off of that, so Citizen Sleeper takes on like the actual mechanics of the game, take a lot of DNA from, traditional tabletop games where, normally the DM is kind of setting this scene, and then the players are reacting, and they roll dice to determine if what happens with their actions. But in Citizen Sleeper, you kind of take this approach of like you have a hand of dice, and then you can kind of utilize those dice to do various actions however you see fit. And there's kind of I don't know, it's a different kind of turn on that system. And I think maybe if we could start there and kind of how you came to that, that'd be really great for us to maybe break open some of the other really interesting things the game is doing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the hand of dice was, for me, very much about solving the problem of trying to bring randomness and dice rolls into video games. I just think that people who play video games are not very tolerant of randomness, maybe, especially not in the way that a tabletop player is, right? A tabletop player is completely on board usually with the idea of randomness. But what I noticed in something like Blades in the Dark is there's a lot of negotiation around dice rolls. So in that game, the GM has this really nice thing where they set kind of the conditions of the dice roll, so like how risky it is and what the effect of a success will be. So you might have like a limited like effect, and you might have like a risky or dangerous like risk, and you could also negotiate that as a player with the GM. So you can kind of say like, oh, if I try and sneak past this guy, that will be controlled because I'm it's like more likely to happen. Well, if I try and fight him, that might be risky or dangerous, right? So it's like it has these descriptive ways of, and then the player can do things like ask for a devil's bargain, which is one of my favorite rules in Blades of the Dark, which basically gives the GM they can do something. Like usually it's tick a clock, but usually it's like change something, and they'll give an extra dice to the player. And then the player also has various other ways of kind of like they can spend stress, so they can like build a dice pool for a roll depending on how likely or how likely they want it to be that they will get a success, right? And they can invest as much or as little resource into each roll. And so while you do have that randomness, I think there's this really nice kind of selective choice that happens in that game where it's like you can see when a player really wants to do something, they have the tools to at least give themselves a good shot. And if they don't care about something, then maybe they'll kind of like, quote unquote, roll the dice right on it. They'll take the odds and they'll see how it goes. And that gives a really interesting kind of ebb and flow. And so that idea of kind of that's where I started with, wanting to give players access to this kind of like to be able to play with the system and to push and pull. And then the idea of it being a kind of hand of dice just really came from wanting to represent this idea of waking up and having like personal resource on some level, like having the things that you can do, the amount of energy you can do. And once I kind of hit on that idea of like you wake up and you roll your dice and that's you for the day, it just really felt like it was kind of like connecting with everything I wanted. Like I hit on that idea. I was like, okay, this is going to work. This is narrative and thematic, but it also solves kind of like very practical problems about how dice exist in games, because other dice games that I know are games like Tharsis or whatever that expose the player to extreme risk, or games like Disco Elysium where a fail is kind of like just closing the door in your face. Sometimes it leads to a consequence, but most often it just leads to kind of stasis. And neither of those are really what you'd want to do in a tabletop situation. So, my idea was to try to find a third way between those two.
At what point did you kind of feel that, the dice were working in this really resonant way to comment on, oh, this is a person living and moving through the world? Because I think I was floored multiple times by just how effective that was in kind of making you feel the stress of being alive. And so often there were moments in the game where someone will ask you for help or ask you to do something. There's the moment where I think you're being asked to watch someone's kid, Mina, I think. Well, one of the characters kind of goes to work their shifts, and I would be like, I've only got a couple dice, and I really got to make some money to get my medicine, so I don't think this is gonna. And so it really helps build this feeling of anxiety about moving through the world just so effectively. And was there a moment for you where you're like, yeah, this is gonna hit?
I think it was to do with I paper prototyped the game a little bit, and to just use dice and just have dice. And I just made these little stacks of index cards that represented progress through a story, and you'd have to put a certain number on them. So let's say like it would be numbered like 20 or whatever, and you just assign the number. So you just stack the dice up. You roll them each day, and you stack them up on these index cards. And then when you clear the card, you take it away, and like you've got the next thing. And that was how I paper prototyped it. And when I was doing that, I rolled like a hand of wands, right? And I was like, oh, like immediately just kind of like, what do I do with this? Like, this is and it was such it created such an interesting like moment for me that I think that was part of it. But I think the other side of it was really just me being very aware from my own experiences how precarity, like financial and kind of social precarity, exposes people to luck. Like, you are most close to the kind of true luck when you are at an extreme level of precarity. And I've had moments in my life where I remember one where I like you have like paid travel cards in London, and I had just enough money to get home. But because of the way the travel cards work, if you don't touch them at both ends of a journey, you get like an instant fine. And sometimes it just randomly does that, even if you do touch them at the ends of both journeys. It's just like, for some reason, the system just goes wrong, right? And so I had just enough money to get home from across the city, and I went to touch it in, and it was like, gave me a fine, and just wiped the card. I didn't have any money in my bank account, have any money. So I had to, and that to me, that was the kind of moment that I wanted to put in Citizen Sleeper, that kind of thing where it's like, well, I'm trying, like I'm being responsible. I'm trying to make this work. And then it's like, no, luck is just like, nope, that's good. You don't get it. Like, sorry. So yeah, I did want to give people that feeling sometimes.
That's not really interesting. I mean, it's like, I guess my only exposure to, tabletop role-playing games is like super traditional, like Dungeons and Dragons. And obviously, like, when you look at the mechanics, fairly restrictive system when you think of like dice rolls and things like that. Whereas with this, I think it really struck me just that dice hand idea, because it spoke so much to just like thinking about how we navigate the world, thinking about like mental illness. Like some days you're going to wake up and you only got the 3 dice. And, sometimes that little one, that one roll, you're going to get something, but it's going to be really marginal. And I just felt like it really, it made me connect more with the character than I've really experienced in most other games. Like I was saying to Ben, prior to us hopping on this call, that in a lot of role-playing games more traditionally is like dialogue is the choice. You're making choices. They're like the dialogue choices. They're hyper binarized, and I never feel like that's the thing I would say. And in Citizen Sleeper, I've always felt as I'm playing that maybe it's not verbatim what I'd say, but it's like emotionally how I'd react whenever I get a dialogue choice. And I think that is just reflective of kind of the ways you've built these systems. And it's just it's not even a question. It's just like a really interesting way I think you've went about designing the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an advantage I have over other RPGs, because I think that there's a kind of design concept in video game RPGs which is about this kind of quote unquote meaningful choice idea that means that there has to be like a broad range of kind of equally meaningful choices, and none of them really in a way like mean very much to your character, they're all about like pushing other people around, because your character often doesn't kind of have like, I don't know, they sometimes have a stake in it, but so often in RPGs, like making a choice is actually making a choice for somebody else. It's like pushing the guy off the cliff or like pulling him up. But because the character has to be this very broad container for a huge number of stories, it's kind of hard to do it. While in Citizen Sleeper, it's like, I'm really interested in this idea of making RPGs about like a specific experience that's not about like you can be anybody, which is kind of like the original promise of the role-playing game, right? It's like you can be a sprightly elf, or you can be like a heavyweight barbarian, right? Like you can be all these different people, and you can play in that world. And I guess the thing I was kind of interested in doing with Citizen Sleeper is like, I can't do that in a video game. It's quite hard to do that in a video game. And it's kind of, I'm not super interested in it. So I'm like, well, what if I bring all the people that play the game to role play one quite specific experience? And I tried to give a range within that, but it's like, there is no way you can role play Citizen Sleeper as like a rich industrialist, right? Like it's not within the scope of the game. And so it means I can be more nuanced, I think, in terms of like exploring the very particular emotional experience that's there, right? The range is reduced, but I'm super interested in that. I'm super interested in like small RPGs and RPGs being allowed to be smaller. And I was thinking about role playing as like being something that can be, that's not about offering a free choice, because I don't think that relates to what it's like to live in the world. And I think RPGs are actually like, yeah, they're often about like putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody in their life. And so I think it's interesting to explore like, well, what are the implications of that, rather than just like, oh yeah, I can do that. I can be a farmer for 5 seconds, and being a farmer means I plant crops and dig them up and sell them, and that's all that being a farmer is. And it's like, well, no, we all know that's not what being a farmer is. So it's not the full emotional range, but it's like a tick on the back of the box or whatever. It kind of, you can do anything. So I'm interested in more the specificity in exploring that.
I was listening to an interview that you did with Austin Walker, kind of formerly of Waypoint, and he kind of made the point that it's like, it does make it more resonant when you can never choose to stop being the sleeper, that is kind of a political choice that really frames the world around you. And I was thinking, both the dialogue feels more effective, but I think the choices themselves, that it's like, you can choose not to move a relationship forward. You're not ultimately faced with a dialogue choice where you're like, fuck you, or I love you. It's really about, do I want this relationship to progress or not? And I just found that really effective, because again, it feels true to life in this way, where it's like, oh, my bud has asked me to come to a concert that he's putting on, but I've got a shift that I've got to work, and, I'm balancing the things that I have to do. And ultimately, sorry, bud, like I have to go do this other thing. You're not really making dialogue choices, but you are making choices about whether or not you show up. And I felt like that was really well captured in this the way that you've set up these very limited choices.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great to hear, because that's exactly what I want, the idea that like, yeah, you turn up for your friends or you don't. You decide who your friends are by them being the people that, typically friends are just like the people that we happen to spend time with, whether by choice or by situation. And so I wanted to try and, get a little bit into that. But then also I think the thing is that the dialogue, it's so hard to make dialogue choices kind of mechanically crunchy. And I think a lot of games have tried that and kind of failed as well. It's so often that it's just kind of a stat, and you can like push your persuasion stat really high, and that just gives you extra dialogue choices, which just immediately like solve a problem usually. And it's just kind of like, well, that doesn't feel very good, and it kind of feels like there's a big gap of design there. So by some of the choices are in the dialogue, but I like to think of dialogue choices as being an expressive space where it gives the player a chance to kind of like express who they feel the character is. And it's not actually about making a decision there. It's about instead like trying out various things. So I try to write dialogue scenes where the player gets a chance to kind of talk about the things they might do. So they say like, oh, I might help you, or I might, and they kind of get to make promises a little bit, not necessarily to the character, but to themselves about, well, I've kind of said now that I'm interested in this. Like they get to think through it. And then it's in the gameplay where they can actually make those choices and turn up. But in the gameplay, I have a lot more levers and screws to kind of like turn, right, and to pressure the player and make those choices hard. So, yeah, I can do that thing to you where you're like, oh, I want to help out my friend, but I know that I'm not going to get paid for helping out my friend and babysitting their child, and I know that I need money to eat. And so it's like, yeah, I can see that those things are going to be chewy and interesting decisions. And so I want to put the decisions there, not have them in the dialogue. So the dialogue's more of, yeah, this kind of like explorative space for the player to explore the kind of role-playing of the character.
I want to ask you a little bit, because you brought it up already, about Disco Elysium, because I think this game really feels to me like it's in conversation with it to some extent, and it feels like they both make choices in setting, not in literal setting. Obviously, Citizen Sleeper is up in space, Disco Elysium is here on a Earth, but they feel like they're set in kind of the wake of, ruined capitalism and, to some extent also failed revolutions. And they both, to me, seem to pose this question of, well, what now? What do we do now? And I'm wondering, why that was a place or a setting that you wanted to explore, and what drew you to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things I like about Disco Elysium are the things that I also like generally about settings. And like that idea of places where history has happened and we're still having to deal with it, where there is actually a sense that this place has been places before, I think comes also from my experience of cities and my interest in them, and that kind of process of like looking at all the layers and living in them and kind of seeing that. And so I think that's something that really attracted me to the eye and the idea of the eye. But then also kind of just a lot of interest in places, especially like the Kowloon Walled City, places that are kind of like fallen between the legislative gaps of society, and had ended up in these kind of weird mid places where like something can grow, and then it's like, but then someone's always going to come and try to like instrumentalize that or change it. And I think there's so many interesting tensions that happen in those places, and so many interesting kind of urban structures that are built there. So I think that stuff is really cool. And like you say, Disco Elysium, it's like a kind of Paris Commune type influence there. It's this weird kind of bit where history is slightly suspended. Like we have we have kind of firing squads and a revolution, and we've had a war, but it's like, right now, what is history right now? It's kind of like, is it, Disco Elysium's always asking that question, like, is history like the accumulation of events, or is it, and you, of course, like the amnesiac character is there to kind of be like without history, and there's this really strong synergy between the idea of personal history and then like the context of history as a wider structure around us. And I found all of that stuff super cool in Disco Elysium. So yeah, I mean, the game is definitely in conversation with it, right? I kind of, it's like, ripped off their way of laying out text. I think like that, I don't know how many other games have done that, but the one I was looking at when I was like, that works, was Disco Elysium. And I also am very grateful to that game for, I think, making prosy style text a bit more mainstream. I think like a lot of people, that would be the first video game they play that had a kind of prose style in its text. And there's like an incredible sequence you can trigger in Disco Elysium where the camera kind of zooms out and it just starts describing like bits of the city, just like bits that you can't go to. There's like, it starts talking about a street that's up on a hill and someone's there, and there's like, and it kind of like goes into this weird like moment where it pulls away. And I think that moment is so cool. And I constantly thought about that, kind of trying to create those kind of moments as well in Citizen Sleeper, where it feels like, because you're using prose, because you're using a literary style, you can kind of do things that you can't do in dialogue. You can like pull back, or you can stretch out, you can compress time, or you can like, reposition the perspective in interesting ways.
That's interesting. I mean, I think another way that I was thinking about that too in the game is, sorry, I don't remember exactly what the term is in the actual game, but essentially like the internet space, or like the cyberspace that exists within. Yeah.
We kind of call it the cloud. It doesn't. To be honest, it kind of has a vague name. Like a few people call it different things, but yeah.
Yeah. It's like I felt like that was really intriguing too when we're thinking about like the eye as a place that has history that existed before you and that has influenced all the characters that you end up meeting. In another interview, you were talking about how you kind of took an approach similar to like Gibson pre-internet of like, you know, we're making this almost psychic space, or the space that that we're engaging with kind of emotionally and mentally in addition to physically. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I thought that was a really interesting approach for the game.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it definitely, that side definitely comes a bit from Gibson and a bit from a kind of interest in banal magic, or like the way in which technology can connect to kind of magical memory. There's a thing in that Gibson said about computers being an analog for human memory, and that was kind of like the basis of his. And I think one of my favorite pieces of writing that of Gibson's is actually the very first science fiction story he ever wrote, which is called Fragments of a Hologram Rose. And it's just this story of a guy in his apartment in a kind of post-apocalyptic United States, and he's got a load of kind of tapes, but they're like tapes which are sensory recordings of memories. And he's kind of scrubbing through these tapes, and they're all concern a relationship that he had. But he's also using this tape that's kind of like a commercial tape of like a yogi like meditating on a beach that you're supposed to use when you try to go to sleep. You play this like sensory tape, and they're kind of blending, and the story is kind of blending these layers of tape. And he becomes fixated on the fact that there's at the edge of one of the shots from the yogi tape is like his head moves and he pans across the scene, and in the corner is like a fence and soldiers, because the beach that the yogi is on is kind of like in a private, protected, gated community. And so there's like this presence of like violence in the memories and like of kind of like wider histories of suffering, but it's really just a story about how he broke up with his girlfriend. And it's so good, and it's like 10 pages long. And it's the kind of thing that in a way, like it feels like such a strong piece of cyberpunk literature, but it also feels like, and it feels so relevant to us and how we experience the world. But it's also kind of like people have stopped writing about technology like that because it's become so banal. It's become kind of seemingly banal and boring to talk about it. And so what I wanted to do was like somehow like go back to this way of talking about technology as like a kind of psychic space of memory, and kind of the ghosts of history and the past could somehow like get in there. And that was kind of what I started to create then in the cloud, which is, you know, like a space that both contains like other beings that are kind of like, but those beings are like produced by the history of the eye. They're all kind of artifacts as well as beings. And then at the same time to try and treat data not as just kind of like a resource, but try to think about it as like a kind of a weird remnant that's kind of like everywhere, that in a place like that, in a kind of like imaginary, completely technological environment, right? There is nothing natural on the eye apart from that which has been brought, and even that has been modified and changed and become somehow like networked. Then there's this idea that there must be data everywhere. There must be little bits of memory, you know, tucked away in corners. And if, you know, in the Internet of Things where your fridge has a computer inside it, right? It's like, well, yeah, like maybe could an AI grow there, right? Like if you leave your fridge alone for of course we know it's like it's absurd, but that was the kind of atmosphere I wanted. This feel of like someone brought up recently that I used the word like loam. I talked about like loam and of data, and use these kind of words, and I think that was the kind of thing I was after, this sense of like fecund and fertile technology, you know, like to go with the mushrooms, right? That like it's all decay and it's all kind of potentially becoming something at the same time. But it's hard to write about technology like that if you're going to be like, yeah, Facebook or social media, right? Like it's you have to find the kind of more psychic core of technology.
That's interesting. No, I mean, like, it's funny. The thing that I was thinking about when I was playing the game in relation to those ideas, which is kind of maybe a little strange, is that, like, you know, a lot of my research in my MFA was around like Black liberation and like rediscovering the archive, and how we can, you know, use archival documents to rethink or re-see histories that aren't actually written. And somebody like Christina Sharp with her book In the Wake is a book that has kind of like fundamentally influenced my worldview. And one of the quotes in that book is that the past that is not the past reappears always to rupture in the present. And so much of how the cloud works, I think, in Citizen Sleeper, in some ways is like analoging to that. Like we have the internet as we see it today is kind of obfuscated, but it's kind of this archive of human history that has so much that is kind of left on the margins. And it takes certain people from different positionalities to see those histories. And I think that the Sleeper, the way that you've written how they engage in those systems, kind of speaks to the ways in which marginalized people have to uncover histories because of how they've been rewritten. So again, not really a question, but just like, damn, you're firing on all cylinders, Gareth.
Oh no, but I think that's a great observation, and that's not, I can totally see it, but it's also like, I love to hear this stuff because it's kind of like, there's something I've heard a few things like this when people talk about Citizen Sleeper where I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Like I love that way of reading it. And it's not that stuff isn't there, because it obviously is, but it's more like, I think there's something happens when you kind of start to model these systems of like, this feeling of like, okay, there are big systems, and then there's me, and I'm kind of in the wake of the big system, and there's history, and but I'm just trying to like, what does history mean to me when I'm just trying to make enough money to buy the next meal? And I think, yeah, like it that's what I found has connected with people, is that kind of feeling of like, yeah, this kind of relational quality of being exposed and being on the edge, but also having a kind of curiosity and trying to find ways of like you say, like bringing things up from the past, or bringing things up from your own past, and trying to kind of like build a kind of like logic and a system and a structure that could somehow be other than whatever this is it feels like that's that kind of really connected with people's experiences, which is, yeah, it's really nice. I've part of wanting to make this game was to want to make a science fiction story about what I felt my generation was concerned about, and I can't speak for that many people, so I just was like, okay, well, what am I concerned, like what are the things that I feel have become like big influences in my life and big moments? And I think that one of the things that was written on a post-it and stuck next to the thing was just precarity, and that idea of exploring all of what precarity means, and trying to have characters who would also help explore that, right? Who would help give different voices there, and allow for a kind of like, yeah, many different versions of that story to be told in that space. So yeah, I think that's that's already making me think like, oh, how can I like encourage that reading, right? Like how can I massage some of that in, because that's great. Like I love this idea of the archive, and there's a great science fiction book called Blackfish City. Okay. And it's about like but it's about like it was a big influence on Citizen Sleeper. It's about a city in a kind of like post-climate emergency situation, and it's like this floating oil platform that's become a kind of refugee city in the Arctic, well, Antarctic. It'd be Antarctic, I think. And it's about the communities that kind of grow up there and how they interact. But there's this thing that comes up at the start of the book where basically there's this kind of podcast that is kind of distributed on the black market that is just a load of stories being read by completely different voices, and nobody knows who makes it, and nobody knows if the stories are the stories of the people reading them, or if they're made up stories, but it's become a kind of like marker of the city, and it's this very like slowly building archive of trying to somehow describe the city, right? And it's like that impossible problem of describing the city, and it's kind of just like a kind of background thing that runs throughout the book, and it doesn't have any kind of plot significance as far as I remember. It doesn't kind of like become something, but I just love the idea of like what the alternative archive of the city, like how we describe that. So I think like an alternative archive of the eye would be fun to also try to construct in this space.
Gareth, I feel like single-handedly you got me to re-pick up William Gibson. I feel like I'm genuinely taking a lot of sci-fi recs from you, and I'm like, okay, this is what I gotta pick up next. One of the things I kind of wanted to get you to talk about, and you kind of, I think, alluded to it at the beginning, but over the course of kind of this season and the folks we've been talking to, a lot of people have talked about, again, I think this idea of precarity and finding this space for the art that they want to create, the things that they want to do, while also being alive and often having to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet and trying to make all of that work. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about your own situation in trying to find the space to work on something like this while also, having a day-to-day, life job. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Citizen Sleeper, it's kind of, there's something kind of ironic to me about the fact that I could only make this game having left the conditions in which like the game was born, right? In the crucible that the game was kind of forged in was the crucible of me being unemployed, me trying to get work as an illustrator, as a designer, me working for employment agencies and working kind of 0-hour contract jobs where you're not guaranteed work, working as a game tester and having to get the very first train at like 5:30 in the morning to travel 2 hours to go play games all day, and kind of just seeing all the layers of the city through all of these different processes and meeting so many people, which I think, like definitely working a lot of shit jobs is good for writers. I think it's as long as you get out the other side of it, I think it's a good experience for writers. But actually, the thing that allowed me to make Citizen Sleeper was the success of In Other Waters, which I began in the final year of my PhD and kickstarted it, and then got a publisher on board and they funded it. And that was kind of like I could slowly reduce the freelance work and reduce the kind of like side gigs and everything else. And then Citizen Sleeper has been kind of like allowed to be made in like that kind of sanctified space of like, I can just do this. Like I can just do this one thing, and I can focus on it. And so that's in a way like it was immediately the thing I wanted to do after In Other Waters, was to make a game about the experience, because I felt like I'd been given a shot to do something. Like In Other Waters had done well enough for me to kind of like get the funding and for me to have a passive income on some level that would allow me to do this work. And I was like, well, what am I going to do with that time? It's like, well, I want to tell this story, like this story about all of these experiences and about how I feel it is to be in the world. And I was like, I want to, that's the only thing I can do now. I have to use these conditions for this. And so it just came very quickly, I think, like the idea of doing that. It was kind of like an immediate decision to do it. But it's been it's been a rapid, but it's been a kind of, I guess, a very driven experience in that sense, because maybe while Citizen Sleeper took less than 2 years to make, just 2 years from beginning proper development to launch date, almost exactly, I think that in reality, like so many of the ideas and so much of the thinking has been in my mind for, almost 20 years. So it's kind of like, it's almost like it's all built up there. And then it's like when you have the opportunity to unleash it, it's like you could just go. You just go and you could do it. So that's what it kind of felt like, I think.
Interesting. I mean, so at the top of the show, you also said that you kind of view Sleeper as like a living project. And, recently you all have announced that you're having a couple DLC drops in the future. I'm curious, like, if you feel comfortable talking a little bit about like what you mean by that living project. Is this something where like maybe you could imagine yourself, making something else that's in the world, or like seeing this slowly build out into something bigger?
Yeah, totally. I mean, from the beginning, I was kind of like, I want to begin here, but I want to leave things open. I think In Other Waters for me was a game that was like one story, and I didn't necessarily care too much to kind of imagine the world around it because I wasn't interested. I was interested in this one particular story, and in a way, like this one story just between three beings, like just the AI and Ellery and Minet, and just this kind of like weird family / romance / kind of like scientific expedition that happens between them. But for Citizen Sleeper, I was like, okay, the Sleeper is this kind of model, but I want to make a space where it's like, in a way, like 50% of it is this Sleeper experience, but maybe even more than 50% of it is like these other stories and these kind of like wonderful. Maybe it's a Gibson thing. This kind of like, this is one of his books, like Count Zero, is like begins like the slam hound caught Turner's trail in New Delhi, and he never explains what a slam hound is. And that's something I like doing in Citizen Sleeper, is kind of like introducing lots of slam hounds everywhere, like lots of little things that might one day grow. One, because I think that's fun for science fiction, but two, because that's what I do in tabletop games when I'm running them, right? You're constantly leaving yourself little things that might connect. They're like potential connections that exist in the world that you can then use if the player goes in that direction, or you could, and if you really love them, you might like force them back in later on without the player knowing, or you might not. You might just drop them immediately. And so in that spirit, I think I was immediately drawn to the idea of then doing kind of episodic storytelling within the space. So that it's almost like the next experiment, I think, the DLC, because it's specifically a 3-part episodic story told in the space of the game. And it has its own arc, and I think if people play it and follow along with it, it's like they'll have a specific experience. And I wanted to try and get closer to GMing for people who were playing the game, and I wanted to see how close I can get. Like it's very rare, I think, for a small or solo developer to do an episodic structure, but I think I find it really exciting. I even kind of conceived of Citizen Sleeper kind of as a TV show where all the character arcs are just accessible at any time, right? Rather than being broken up into episodes, it's like a season of a TV show where you can decide which characters you want to follow and which ones you don't want to follow, or you can decide when you're bored with a plot line and you want to jump over, cut, and go to whatever's happening over there. And so, the idea of continuing that just comes very naturally to me. And so that's kind of, the DLC is just like an automatic part of that, but it's also part of an experiment in seeing how episodic storytelling can go and what will work for people, and how this kind of story engine that I've built with the dice and the writing can kind of, what kind of stories can it tell, and where can they go? So we'll see where it takes me.
Is this a story that you can, are you still playing as a sleeper, or is this someone else on the eye?
Yeah, so it's just another arc in the game, okay. Just like if you were to pick up any of the other arcs. But the difference is it's a bit longer because it's broken up into 3 episodes. I think it probably end up being the longest arc in the game. But it's also just that idea specifically of creating episode breaks, creating these moments. It was something I even thought about doing in the original game, is like breaking it up into sessions somehow, finding like a moment where I could like drop a trigger, because I really like the idea of calling them sessions, because it's a reference to tabletop games, but it's also a reference to Cowboy Bebop. And so I love that idea that like you'd have this kind of like session structure, but it became it messes with the pacing too much. And I like the kind of like totally madcap pacing of Citizen Sleeper, where it's like, I actually don't know as a game designer what plot lines you're going to do in what order, and that's quite fun. So yeah, but this story is like is one of those arcs, but I guess that it's specifically oriented towards bringing new people from places we haven't seen into the eye, and having them talk about those places, and having influences come in from the outside, and the player getting to witness like, how does that change the eye, and what's happening in the wider system around it, and then what's happening kind of maybe in the wider universe, or like what are the big forces at work here. So I wanted to try and like, just kind of like slowly pull the camera back over the course of this episodic story, so that when I finish it, it's kind of like we're in a slightly different position. We're not down there in the sleeper's apartment. Maybe we think, players are starting to think about the other places that are in this system and what might be happening there.
Can I get you just briefly to talk about some of the endings of Citizen Sleeper? And I've seen, I think about 3. I don't know how many there are, but they all strike me as having some kind of element of escaping the eye, like getting away from it. And yeah, I don't know. It struck me as I guess kind of sad. I think like there's a way in which like I actually ended up feeling like I like being here, and I have come to know a lot of these people and feel comfortable here. And there was something about finding that it feels like, oh, no matter what, there's a kind of leaving. I have to go at the end. That has kind of stuck with me, and I'm wondering if you can talk about why that was important, I guess, in the different endings.
I guess so. That is just what defines a plot line which ends in an ending for me. Is any of the plot lines which end with the choice to stay or to leave. That's I just made a decision that was kind of like where the credits are going to play. Because it's kind of funny when you make this kind of open structure, you kind of have to give people an out. And so I wanted to make sure they were outs and they were kind of labeled vaguely, or at least people got a sense, and that people could hit them, but then also people could continue. I always aspire towards making games where people can go and hang out in them at any point. So even if they've got a finished save file, I think it's really important to allow people to go back and spend time in the game if they want to, or continue if they want to. And I try to respect people's time by not like locking them out or deleting the save, or and kind of saying like, well, you finished, you have to do a new run. I think some people don't like that. Some people have told me like, oh, I did all the endings and I stayed, and then there's nothing left in the game. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, there's DLC coming, but so you could keep playing that. But yeah, like there will be an end eventually. But for me, that choice between leaving and staying is so important to the story, because the sleeper at the end of the day is someone on the run on some level. And I guess I wanted to leave it open to the player about what the resolution for something like that, what the resolution for the precarity or risk is. And I wanted to respect all the choices as much as possible. So I didn't want to offer any endings that I didn't agree with or find interesting. I needed to be able to write them all in a way that kind of felt like, yeah, okay, that's worth doing. But I think the question about leaving an ending in the game is often structured around also like what compromises or what are you willing to give up? I think like, for example, if you're going to leave, spoilers, stop listening, for 5 minutes if you don't want to hear this. But like, if you want to leave on the colony ship, it's like you're agreeing to tie yourself to something much bigger than yourself, right? And you're either saying to yourself, I believe in their dream and that will carry me, or you're saying, I'm so small that I can hide in the underbelly of their dream and they will never know I was there. That's kind of like, but if you stay, it's like you're kind of saying like, you're kind of rejecting the idea of tying yourself to a dream of a new world, or that anything can actually be true. It's a kind of skeptical or realist perspective. And so I try to have the characters like talk about that. And yeah, I try to be discursive. I think some of the endings were really tough to write. The ending where you kind of like decide to give up on your body, right? Is a kind of like combination for me of like a fantasy I've had, but also like the worst possible thing that you could do, which is essentially just like give up on yourself and give up on being a human, and just say, okay, I'm done now, I'm out. And that was also really hard to write because it's such a tension point of kind of like, the feeling of like wanting to go or to be something else, and then knowing that is that choice open to us? Can we actually, can we dissolve? Can we become moss or just become other energy moving around? Or so, yeah, I guess like the endings are the point of where I allow a lot of it's a point where you can let it all kind of come to a head, and I guess the choice of the ending for the player is like, in a way, like them choosing a thematic frame, I think, in some level. Like there are a few different thematic frames in the game to pick from, and I think players kind of like resonate with one or another, and that's where they end up kind of ending their story or continuing it, which is in my set, like in the game, is a choice, right? It's choosing to continue is choosing.
Yeah, I loved very deeply the fungus ending that you're kind of talking about, where there's an option to just leave. There was something about the description about the tiredness and like the option of feeling no longer tired and feeling no longer tied to this body. that was just very powerful.
Yeah, I'm glad. I mean, they were very powerful for me to write. I think they're some of the most difficult things. That was one that when I was writing, I was like, I don't know if I can put this in the game. I had to find a way to write, because I had to offer both choices. I had to offer the choice to leave or the choice to stay, and that means I had to do that. I had to make both of those be positive choices for the player, and so I had to really kind of screw my brain into that headspace and kind of feel like what is it about this? But I also wanted to counterpoint each one with the, with the other, and yeah, I was very careful with that choice to make sure the player couldn't accidentally do that. I had to, I give them a kind of like looking over their shoulder moment to kind of, here's the counterpoint just in case you've been thinking about it, because that felt. Yeah, I felt like I wanted to make that ending feel as safe as possible for people.
This is interesting. I don't know if this is a stupid question, but something I've been thinking about, maybe because, I recently had surgery, and like during recovery, for the first week or so, I had kind of limited mobility, and where I live in Seattle, it's like a very hilly region where, specifically where my apartment complex is, I'm on one of the steepest hills in the city. And because of that, I couldn't, part of my recovery involved I need to go outside, and I needed to go on walks and things like that. But because of where I live, I could literally only walk basically this 2-block radius, because I couldn't get up the hills. And what that meant was that I couldn't go to the grocery store. I couldn't get food from somewhere. I had to rely on my partner or gig workers to get food and things like that, and groceries and toiletries. And it was a really kind of eye-opening experience, I think, for me as somebody who isn't a disabled person, of just thinking about how infrastructure is set up in ways that completely disallows for people with disability to often navigate their lives in the most basic way. And thinking about that in Citizen Sleeper, all the characters in the game are so interesting, and they all have such interesting backstories and character arcs. I'm curious, maybe, why was it important for you to have the Sleeper as a character who's navigating disability, and if that was something that kind of was there from the beginning, or something that as you were kind of building out all these different characters, you were like, this is kind of the story I'm interested in telling, because it feels like something that I haven't seen a lot of in games, at least not not super indie games. So
yeah, I think that's a really important part of what I was trying to explore. Definitely, I think the idea of disabilities of all kinds and how they affect our ability to even forge relationships, but to just live in the world. But then I also I wanted to be very, I don't know, I guess I was doing that as something that came from somewhere quite personal to me, and so I kind of felt, in my case, it's disabilities connected to mental health that I've experienced, not physical disability. But I think there's a kind of obvious resonance between those. And certainly I remember during some of the worst periods of being unemployed, kind of just feeling well, this is just unfair, because it's well, not only can I not get a job or make any money, but it's some days I wake up and I can't even apply for a job, or I can't even get close to the point of even beginning to solve this problem, right? And it's you can get so frustrated at that, because you're kind of it just feels impossibly far. And while I didn't want to make the player feel that things were impossibly far, and that's why the game is kind of maybe a little, it could be so much crueler, right? You could have to pay for transport tickets, you could have to use your energy to move around, you could have to pay rent, right? I wanted to simplify things, but that's a core part of it. And then the characters, the characters, idea with all of the characters from the very beginning was the idea of like recognizing how systems have affected them, and that in some cases was their bodies, and in some cases was their psychological experience, in some case it was just like the way they see the world. But I wanted there always to be that kind of feeling of like there's like evidence of what systems do to people's bodies and they do to people in all around you, like constantly in different forms. And that was just kind of the kind of characters that I want to write. And maybe it's also because I just didn't, I don't know, yeah, maybe it's just the way I think about characters, because I had fun also kind of trying to think about science fiction tropes like mercenaries and things, and then trying to be like, well, what actually does that mean? And like, what systems is a mercenary implicated in? And that was enjoyable for me. And I guess that's just what I'm attracted to. That's why I like Cowboy Bebop, because it's kind of like, yeah, bounty hunting is like a really shitty job, and I love that it's both a joke and a serious point. It's both a kind of gig work idea, but it's also like a comedy about bounty hunters who never somehow manage to get paid, right? Like at the end of every episode, somehow there's like a technicality, and I think that, yeah, there's something really great about that, because I think that speaks to something we all know. Other game, I think The Witcher is another game that does that really nicely. There's a great quest in The Witcher where like a guy's like, go catch in The Witcher 3, there's a guy in the Skelligs who's like, go catch a dragon, and you can tell him over and over again in the dialogue, like, it's not a dragon, it's just a wyvern, like stop saying it's a dragon. And then when you come back and you say like, oh, I killed it, and you show him the head, he's like, oh, that's not a dragon, it's a wyvern, you were right. I guess you should just get paid like half the fee that I promised you. And it's like this old guy's just totally done you in this way, in this wonderful way. And I really like those stories. I like those characters. So I was really attracted to playing those games with the player as well, and writing those people. I think those are just the people that come out when I sit down to write.
It sounds like you're talking a little bit about Ethan, who sleeper hit in my opinion, the bounty hunter who's kind of chasing your sleeper character. I loved Ethan very, very deeply. As much as he's like a monster, there was something about him that I just found very attractive, and I think especially as it unspools itself, and I think the game gives this beautiful moment where you're like, is this guy going to be with me? Is he going to be? Are we in this together? And then when the turnaround eventually comes, it's just picture perfect.
Yeah, he was really fun. I mean, it's so funny because he started off life very much as what does the main character of like Cyberpunk 2077 look like if you're just a regular person? Like, what do they look like if you're running the noodle stand? Like, what does this total asshole with guns who turns up every once in a while to like irritate you, what does he look like? Or like, what does a Blade Runner really like? What is a Blade Runner really? Because they're just an asshole, and it's kind of like there's no way for a Blade Runner to be like a good person. Like that's just like fundamentally they are like a police bounty hunter hunting marginalized people. Like, and so yeah, that was the kind of the starting point, and I was like, oh yeah, this guy's going to be like the villain, the true villain. And then I was running through references, and we were looking at like character. Kind of like Guy Pearce in Memento was like a reference, but also like in Leon, Gary Oldman's character is like cop in Leon who's like on amphetamines, I think, and he's just like wonderful. He's kind of like charismatic, but also he's an absolute monster. And the more we kind of got into the character design, and we were like, oh, he's got to have this like absurd shirt, and we did loads of different designs for this absurd shirt that he has to have. Both me and Guillaume were like became increasingly attracted to this character, and we're both increasingly like, this guy's really like. And so I started like more of that fed into it, and I started to think about all the really charismatic assholes that I've had in my life, and the way that you kind of always are waiting for their attention on some level, even though their attention is always bad. Like when they turn their attention to you, they mistreat you horribly, but for some reason they have like this quality. And so yeah, I played a lot like with the writing in Citizen Sleeper as well. I tried to GM as much as possible, so I tried not to like just write a plot and then write the scenes that make that plot. I tried to write a scene and then evaluate where I'm at the end of the scene, And so there were times when I was writing Ethan and I was like, yeah, there's going to be a redemption arc here. And as I worked through, I was like, no, there's not. It's not going to happen. Like, it's not going to come together for this guy. But it just like it came naturally out of the process of writing him. So it was really fun. And I think that I do think there's something that happens there in kind of tabletop fiction that feels very not real, but maybe earned. Is that like you can kind of feel it out, and it means that even when the bad thing happens, it's kind of like, yeah, we all knew that that's what was going to happen. Like, why were we fooling ourselves? So yeah, I tried to stick on that track with him.
I feel like we're winding down a little bit, but I'm wondering if there's something in the course of all this, and you have done so many interviews, but is there something that, hasn't been asked of you that you're like, this is something that I want to talk about relative to this game?
God, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I've talked about it a lot. And actually it's hearing other people that kind of, it's actually the process of other people telling me how they read it that kind of so often is the thing I haven't heard before. Because I've lived in my version of this, but like, yeah, seeing other people's versions of it is very fun. And it's very rewarding because I think that was a big part of the game for me, is this belief in that this was something that I kind of explored in my PhD, but like that the idea of like collaborating with a system, with a procedural system or any system of any kind as a writer or an artist is not about building the perfect system, which will at the press of a button generate like the perfect output. It's about this kind of this potential of things to mean multiple things, which in like text is called polysemy, like the potential of a word to mean other things. And I kind of like tried very much in the design of Citizen Sleeper to have like everything that happens in the game be able to mean multiple things, and to be able to like there to be talk between characters, even if those characters could never meet, because I'd have to build like an insane machine to replicate like the I didn't want to try to make it. It's impossible to make a tabletop game on a computer. You can't do it, because a tabletop game is like this incredible improvisational thing that you're playing with other people, and it's live, and it's kind of liberating in that sense. But I do think that there's ways of making people feel that everything is connected without everything being literally systemically connected. And I think in video games, people are so often like obsessed with this systemic connection, but it's like, no, everything can be connected just by theme and by an awareness, like a tuning of everything to have fuzzy edges and to sit close to each other. And so that was all the time what I was trying to do. And I feel very vindicated in that when I hear people then coming back with like, oh, well, I played this thing first, and that means that like this game is obviously this, and that was like my core path through this game. And I'm like, yeah, that's fantastic. That's not what I meant, but I it's what I allowed for, I guess. Like I wanted to allow for that. So yeah, the thing I haven't heard that I want to talk about is always like what path people took through the game.
Well, I mean, that was a phenomenal answer to end on. Gareth, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been such a great conversation, and I feel like it's kind of expanded my thinking in a number of directions. So I really appreciate you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was really nice. And again, yeah, I'm thinking about archives now and memories and history, and I think, yeah, that's going to find its way into the world, I think, somehow.
When are you releasing the list of sci-fi novels that went into the creation of this game?
Yeah, soon, I guess. Yeah, that's a Steam blog post if there ever was one, I think. But yeah, I think if you start with Blackfish City and William Gibson's Count Zero, then you're in a good place. Those are good. And yeah, I earlier mentioning like Fragments of a Hologram Rose, like the first Gibson short story, which I think people talk about Neuromancer because it's the novel that created cyberpunk, but like that's Gibson's first science fiction story, and it's kind of like everything is there. Everything that he would ever do is just like in those 10 pages, which is it's great.
And that was our conversation with Gareth Damien Martin about Citizen Sleeper, about cyberpunk literature, about the importance of visual novels in this form. Really, again, this eye-opening conversation. And I think that the conversation does a really good job at showing why Citizen Sleeper is not only going to be getting a Benny, but also a Philly.
Oh, wow. A Benny and a Philly? Should we create a joint award, or are we going to do this separately? Like, what's the situation here?
I think that they're definitely like dueling awards ceremonies that happen on the same night.
Oh, shit. But like, what if everyone goes to the Phillies and then I'm left with like a bunch of awards sitting on my couch? This feels sad. I don't know if I want this anymore.
Well, maybe Gareth will retweet the Benny.
You think
That's what you can hope for.
You think everyone's going to go to the Phillies and like I'll be lucky if I get a little retweet?
Yeah, like maybe what will happen is like Gareth will be at the award ceremony for the Phillies holding the award, and then like he'll zoom in to the Bennies and do like the secondary.
I don't know. Now it feels like a competition, and I don't know. Didn't this game teach you anything, Phil, about the importance of community and like helping each other? I feel like you missed the point of Citizen Sleeper.
Well, I guess I'm gonna have to play it again. No regrets. No, I mean this game was really, really good. I think for all the reasons that we talk about in the show, and just like thinking about, at least for me, what I kind of was left thinking about was visual novels as a medium. And Gareth's whole point about like it started, the first kind of conception of the idea was like this novel, and then they wrote like 100,000 words that ended up being the kind of script and descriptions for the game. And then from there, they started conceptualizing what the actual game would look like. And I think then, it's no secret to us that we've been talking a lot about like visual novels and like interactive fiction as a medium, and maybe like that in connection to regular, like more traditional like novel writing, and why this form is becoming so much more attractive to writers. And I think that that this game, at least to me, like made a really good argument of like, damn, maybe I should consider like more interactive fiction or something in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talk about this a lot, I think, because I sometimes, and I know that I'm just like an old man for this, but sometimes I feel like I don't really resonate with visual novels, and I'm like, well, I would just read the book. I just, why isn't it just a book? And I feel like that there was something different about this game that like made it feel like it worked. Like it worked better for me in a lot of ways. Like it felt like a game. There was something about the mechanics that really worked and felt engaging throughout and felt important to the story in a way that I think a lot of visual novels, I just end up feeling like I'm kind of flipping pages. Again, send your hate mail to originstory.show, and I'll make Phil read it.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the quotes that kept on sticking out to me when I was editing the conversation was Gareth's point about, when you are living a life of precarity, you at those moments of your life, you're the most open to the concept of luck. And like luck is the most visible when you're in a precarious situation. And I think that speaks so well to like the most resonant moments of the game because of how they've designed the dice hand mechanic, where at least for me, it is this game was firing on so many more cylinders than some other kind of interactive fiction projects because of how it's kind of interested in like, you're not always going to be able to do things perfectly. You're kind of given the hand that you're dealt, and that hand ultimately influences how you interact with the people in the world. And it just really, I have never really experienced that in a game before, at least in the same way. And it kind of just has really, really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Since then.
Because again, I think a lot of choice games, in some ways, I think make the altruistic choice the easiest choice to make. Like, you just want to be nice and you want to move through the world. Like, no matter what kind of RPG or whatever you're playing, a lot of those choices, it sometimes is like, well, why would I choose the evil or the hard choice? And I think what this game does well is it makes the altruistic choices costly. And you can feel that you're doing a thing that might actually end up hurting you or even breaking you and your kind of stasis in the world. And I think there's something about making the altruistic choice feel like it's a actually difficult one to make that makes so much of the game like really resonate kind of much more.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even, yeah, I think Gareth mentions in the conversation the whole idea of like, how the trajectory of game design and choice-based games ultimately kind of became one of like, I forget what the term is, but like both choices have to matter, and like both choices should feel satisfying for the player, which ultimately makes those systems so benign, right? Like when it's like a good or evil choice and both are going to give you some major outcome, it just kind of it actually loses a lot of weight. Whereas I think like Citizen Sleeper, a lot of the time, you're kind of given these choices where like maybe there's a choice that has a major action, but oftentimes it's kind of like these. It speaks to the fact that when you are a marginalized person, or especially like a disabled person, you often don't have a lot of choice, and you often don't have a lot of like agency in terms of how you're going to navigate different situations. And I think that the game does a really good job of presenting those, and I think because of that, those choices or the lack of choice actually resonates a lot more than if it was just like, oh, you have two very clear outcomes that are going to happen if you do X.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, I mean, if you all haven't played Citizen Sleeper yet, I would certainly recommend it.
It's got a Philly, it's got a Benny, like it's raking up the awards. You should probably play it.
I'm sure it'll get even more reputable awards than ours, but Benny and the Philly this fall, it's gonna happen. Ben, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at sad_radio_lad. You can, of course, email us. I think I gave you bad intel before, but you can email your hate mail to theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're also taking, as always, recommendations, people you'd like to hear from, stray thoughts that enter your head that you want to voice to someone. You can also check out our website, originstory.show. And our Twitter is @originstory_. Phil, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at 3DCisco. I think I forgot to mention, you can find Gareth on Twitter at JumpOverTheAge. And their website is jumpovertheage.com. From what I recall, Citizen Sleeper is available on all platforms as well as Game Pass. So definitely give it a look if you have somewhere to play it. And as always, thanks to Ryan Hopper for the intro and outro music you hear on the show, and to Melody Hirsch for the awesome design work for Origin Story. I think that wraps us up for today this week. Thanks for listening.